All right, good morning again. February 2nd, 2019, the second day of Black History Month. How's everybody doing on this pretty cold Saturday morning? Not as bad as the last couple of days, but it's not good either. I'm a warm weather person, so you have to forgive me being a little chilly as we shoot these next videos. But this is episode 2 of the Afrolantican Legal Academy's presentation of Afrolantican Jurisprudence. I am your host, your director of this cruise ship, Professor Smith, Professor Bonton, Smitty Bonton, Dre Smith, all types of names. Anyway, so yesterday we talked at length. I try to make them short, but that's how I do. We talked at length about the introduction to Afrolantican jurisprudence in the several chapters and going through 6,000 years of African legal history so that we can witness or describe an extraordinary commitment to the equal protection of law, and that commitment has extended into our African American experience within the American legal community as represented by what's called critical race theory. Spoke about some of the top theorists that we've had there, in Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell. And so now we're past the introduction. Let's go back and start. Let's go through 6,000 years of African legal history and describe more specifically certain instances which present a very extraordinary case, extraordinary commitment to equal protection of the law. In other words, the idea that law and government should treat people, or at least groups, people in groups, equally. That's a feature that I think is somewhat different than American jurisprudence, which focuses on individuals. Not only is Africanism, I guess you could say, more communitarian in a general sense, although there is still respect for the individual, maybe more communitarian in the maybe more communitarian, and that's also reflected in law, where again women, foreigners, the poor versus the rich are supposed to be treated equally. There's a recognition for quote unquote group rights that is lacking in Western legal jurisprudence. So we're going to push through that. We're going to explicate it. We're going to try to describe how it all went. Now, before we go back to the very beginnings, and I mean very beginnings, this particular episode is on the pre-colonial states of Africa and how those societies were born, or basically how those legal societies were born. I think by going through the law and taxation, we get a clearer picture of how these states and countries were formed, how they became great, and then we'll also talk about what happened. Right? If pre-colonial Africa was so great, then what happened? How did we get here? We'll talk about that. We're going to finish this particular episode off with that concern, or at least my opinion on it. So I just want to remind you that this is going to be placed on YouTube. Please go to Afrolantica.com, like the video, subscribe to the page, ask questions in the comments. Hopefully I will respond to them either in the comments or in another forthcoming episode. That'd be great if we could get some questions talking to the screen. I'm used to talking in front of a classroom with a lot of people and being able to sense through their positioning and their process and their eyes and whatnot, whether they're following me, whether I'm going a little too far astray, or whether we're on point. It's hard to do that while I'm looking at myself in the screen. So please, if you have questions or comments or concerns or what have you, or suggestions, please put them in the comment section of Afrolantica.com YouTube page. Please share liberally. Please share liberally. Also, again, I'm the executive director of not just the Afrolantican Legal Academy, but also Economic Justice Law Review. The way we are supported right now is through my recently published book, Taxes, Death, and Trouble: How Starve the Beast Tax Cuts Created the Black Lives Matter Movement. Right? Please go get that on Amazon. Taxes, Death, and Trouble: How Starve the Beast Tax Cuts Created the the Black Lives Matter movement. And the essence of it is basically the last 35 years we've been under this neoconservative program to reduce taxes for the wealthy, as far as estate taxes, income taxes, etc. But at the same time, we're paying the government by raising taxes. This is one thing that people don't understand about Starve the Beast, is we're cutting taxes on the wealthy, but we're raising taxes in the form of sales taxes, sin taxes, criminal justice, fines, fees, forfeitures, and all types of other informal taxes on black people, brown people, and poor people generally. These what we call regressive and racist informal taxes. And by squeezing these poor communities out of whatever little they have, you're creating a huge backlash. You're creating many more confrontations between the police and poor folks, and things are getting haywire, as we see. And so if we're not talking about taxation, we're really not talking about anything, because that's the root cause of the issues here. The neoconservative program to deprive government of the resources it needs to provide a social safety net for the purpose of workers accepting any employment that's offered to them because they have no other choice, regardless of the wages, terms, and conditions. So that's Taxes, Death, and Trouble. Please go to Amazon.com, pick that up. Again, let me know if you like it or not, or if you suggestions, comments, concerns. Again, we'll do a video series explaining the chapters there, and also the second half, which is about black capital accumulation, what we can do to better exploit, more efficiently exploit the subsidies and the benefits that are in the federal internal revenue code. Okay, so that's enough about today's events and whatnot. Let's get back to 6,000 years ago. Well, before we go back 6,000 years ago, this is what I want to do. I want to describe the states, the pre-colonial states of Africa, to give you a better sense of how grand this project is, how much information is out there, how many countries and nations our people have created prior to there being any colonialization, let's say European colonialization of Africa. Again, we know that there's not, we've already gotten rid of the Tarzan and the King Kong and the idea that we were just all in huts and tribes and backwardness, or whatever you want to call it. Hopefully no one's operating under that conception. However, I still don't think people have a very good appreciation for how sophisticated it is. Even if we talk about Black Panther, I'll talk about that later. But the way in which T'Challa took the throne in Black Panther is a little too primitive to me. If you look at pre-colonial African history, monarchs are not chosen through a match of strength, especially over an impressive state like that. We're talking the Queen Mother's elections, councils of state, and what have you. As a matter of fact, Killmonger wouldn't even have been eligible. Well, we'll talk about that later. I love the movie. Not trying to diss the movie. Black Panther was dope. All right. So let's talk about those pre-colonial states of Africa. What are we talking about? All right, well, let's talk about before the Christian era, before the year 0, right? This year 0 is supposed to reflect the year folks believe that Jesus Christ was born in Nazareth in Western Asia, in Palestine or Canaan or whatever. And so many people think of the world in terms of that is modern, starts modern history, and everything before that was primitive. Well, again, we took pains last episode to talk about 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years of Egyptian history and how its legal systems were at its most pristine state 3,000 years before the birth of Christ, or before the Christian era. And so let's describe that. So in the era before Christianity, there were already the states of Kem, which we know as Egypt, Cush, Meroe, Napata, which were all basically located in different places of the Sudan, and basically put them together and you have Nubia. Nubia actually wasn't just one place. It was it had several incarnations and basically capital cities at Cush, Meroe, Napata, and even before then, again, the Egyptians knew them as Taseti, and we'll talk about that. Taseti, that's a very interesting name that's full of interesting things. There was also, before the Christian era, the state of Punt, which we believe is in Kenya. We have records of Queen Hatshepsut, of the first dynasties and all that, making travels and trade routes and communications and whatnot, contacts with the state of Punt, which was in further southern Africa. And then in Western Africa, not Western Africa, but Northern Africa to the west of Egypt was Carthage, right? And folks know about Hannibal Barca, and what have you. So before the Christian era, those are 6 states that exist in Africa. And then again, let me make sure we understand, when we're talking about a state, we're not talking about just a country or an ethnicity or a people or a tribe. We're defining state as the jurisdiction over land, over several provinces, not just one total polity, but several provinces of more than one ethnic group with a ruling class that corrals it all through taxation and military power. Okay, so the laws and bureaucracy are required to maintain that type of political system is a little more sophisticated than in others. And yet 6 existed in Africa before the Christian era, where Europe basically does not have any at this point. Understand that the Greeks were cities. You can call them city-states, and we'll call some others of the Hausa city-states, the Swahili city-states. But Greece was not a large country. It was certain cities that were walled off and then conducted trade. So again, the idea, Rome was a state for sure. And so we see that Africans are very early to the game. Let's talk about that first century, because when we talk about Kem Kush, Meroe, Napata, Punt, Carthage, I mean, we're talking way back, thousands of years back. And so the first century, let's say, of Christianity, years 30, years 50, we have more, right? Egypt has been taken over by the Greeks and Persians, so we're not going to count them. But again, Aksum, when Egypt goes down, Ethiopia rises out on the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. They become the major outlet for luxury goods that come from Africa, right? Again, it's always about African resources. Who is the middleman? Who is the person or the country that gets to take what's in the interior and then trade it for those things that are that come from outside of Africa? Those are the people, those middlemen traders are the ones who tend to get rich. And whoever controls those trade routes basically becomes extremely wealthy. And so the military might of the country is often tested as towards whether they can enforce taxation regularly over the people underneath them, and also protect those people who are taxed from foreign raiders and marauders and what have you. So in the first century AD, 100 AD, there is the state of Aksum, which is Ethiopia, the state of Meroe, which again is Nubia. We have the Berber states also, which Berbers are basically the people of the Vale of North Africa. North Africa is painted as all basically white or Arab at this point, but we know that, again, that is of more recent vintage, that it's always been fairly mixed, and that the Berbers are the people of African descent who lay claim to lands of North Africa. Because but recognize that when we talk about North Africa and other places, when we talk about colonialization, oftentimes the colonizers never really got very far past the coast. Right, that's what they could control with their ships and cannons. But as the further you go into the interior, the darker it gets. And so when we talk about the Berber states, we're talking about vast territories between the Mediterranean and the Sahara. And you had basically a peoples called the Zenata on one side, the Sanhaja on the other. We're going to talk about a queen named Al-Kahina, who was a very prominent resistance fighter to the Arab overtaking of North Africa somewhat later. And then there was also the Sao people south of the Sahara towards Lake Chad. And that also became Can and Borno. So right here we're going to discuss, we would like to take note that the Sahara has never ever, even though regardless of how many pictures or movies you see of just sand and nothingness and barrenness, the Sahara has not been a barrier to civilization or statehood ever. It is difficult to cross. It is a hindrance, but it has never been an entire barrier. And we know that the Sahara 3, 4, 5, and 6,000 years ago was much more fertile than it is now, and that it was even less of a barrier and hosted lots of populations. Let's keep on going. 8th century, the 700 AD. 700 AD, again, most of Europe is not a thing. I mean, we have history on it, the Visigoths, the Franks, and whatnot, but this is deep Middle Ages. We're talking about the Roman Empire falling, and remember, the Roman Empire is a southwest European thing. It really doesn't have much control over the western and northern and northeastern parts of Europe. The Scythians, the Goths, the Franks, and all those were people that the Romans and the Greeks were deathly afraid of, those red-haired wild dudes up top. And so in the 8th century, in 800 AD, 700 to 800 AD, you have Egypt is back to its own control over, although at this time it is controlled in the north by Arabs. Morocco is an established state at this point, and also the Muslim religion being established in the 660s. In a remarkable less than 200 years, it spread throughout North Africa and aided in the establishment of Morocco as a state. Because as we talked about, state meaning a central apparatus and a ruling class ruling over different ethnic groups within the country. And so the more we have trade and intermingling of peoples, we have more incentive to create a state-like apparatus where these folks engage or control this province and have their own local laws and customs. However, they pay taxes and are subordinate to the laws of the federated state. So Egypt, Morocco, Nubia, Ethiopia, Ifriqiya. Ifriqiya is basically Libya, Tunisia, and what have you. Ghana, ancient Ghana is more or less the wealthiest place in the world at this point because now the whole world knows about gold. And so Ghana is the derivations of Ghana, Guinea, right? A guinea stands for a coin, or a guinea man can be a black person. This is all stems from the greatness and the richness of Ghana. There's old maps that show the ruler of Ghana as the richest person in the world. Near Ghana is another state called the Tekrur in Western Africa, closer to the coast. Ghana is more so near the Niger River and controlling the gold that is south of it. Towards the west in the Senegal River, we have a state, again, called Tekrur. There's a little less known about it, but we do know that it is there and that there are towns and ancient ruins that show very, very, very impressive places as early as 700 AD. And then there's the Swahili states. So Eastern Africa, as Egypt falls or gets control of others and Axum rises, then further down the eastern coast, there becomes great trade between Eastern Africa and India, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Persia, and China. Do you understand? One of the things that's we've been trading, East Africa has been trading with China since at least the 3rd century AD. So when people talk about China is in Africa, China's always been in Africa. China's always traded with Africa. I don't know them to have ever enslaved or sent warships to Africa. So I'm not quite sure where a lot of the angst and fear about our ability to trade well with China comes from. Of course, some deals are going to be good, some deals are going to be bad, but the automatic assumption that we're unable or incapable of understanding commercial deals with China is absurd, since we've been doing it for over 2,000 years. So let's even fast forward to 13th century, right? We're talking about 1200, 1250, 1280 AD. Again, England is barely heard of. France is very heard of. We're not in the time of we're coming upon the time of the Renaissance shortly. So these places are subject to the Holy Roman Empire, and their claim to being a state is tenuous, although it's emerging at this point in Europe. But meanwhile, in Africa, let's go through the list. And again, recall what a state is. Not just a people, not just a tribe, not just a country, a state apparatus. Egypt, Ifriqiya, Morocco, Nubia, Ethiopia, Kanem, which is again controlling Lake Chad, Mali, basically taking over from the greatness of Ghana, Songhai, which is a little north of Mali on the Niger River. The Niger River is called the Western Nile because the agriculture and the gold and the trade from those places were immense. Ife, Yoruba. So now we're going down into the Niger Delta. And instead of just a people there, again, great states. Great Zimbabwe. Now we're down in southern Africa, off the Zambia River, and down near Sofala, where we have, again, gold trading, intense international commerce out of these places. The Swahili states are now not just one group. There's several of them, and each of them is controlling land further in the interior. Mogadishu, Malindi, Mombasa, Zanzibar. Zanzibar probably being the most famous, and from Zanzibar we get perhaps the name of the Zanj, East Africans that from that point forward, or even prior to that, populate not just East Africa but Arabia, the Indus Valley of Iraq, in Iran, India. And so, again, we have the Zanj people that took over southern Iraq for a good 40 or 50 years and created its own independent African or black state that controlled parts of the Persian Gulf. Kilwa is also on the Swahili coast. Sofala is further south. And so we can't, I don't know if we're going to call that coastal because it's on the Zambezi River farther inland. And it was, again, a major source of gold in the world at that time. So gold previously, oil, ivory, all of these minerals. Now we got in the Congo, we got all types of rare earth minerals for our smartphones. It's always been about extracting resources, luxury goods, items from Africa, and whoever controls that trade from the interior basically can get very wealthy. So when we're talking about those Swahili states, there's dispute over whether they were, because they became adopted the Muslim religion, whether we give credit to Arabs there too. Once again, to deny the African presence is to deny reality. Again, there was no wholesale migration of millions of Arabs to East Africa. There were East Africans that adopted a religion that worked for them as far as creating a trade network from Eastern Africa all the way to Indonesia, right? If you check out the Muslim world and how it grew as this trade organization or trade brotherhood or trade fraternity that went all the way around the coast of North Africa, down East Africa, down around the southeastern coast of Asia, all the way to Indonesia. So you can track the spread of the Muslim religion through international trade along the coast. And also beginning as a response to white supremacy, right? As a response to European hegemony on the one hand, but then also Mongol hegemony on the eastern end, right? Both being northern peoples that tended to come down and try to subjugate southern peoples that were more advanced at the time. Unfortunately, they eventually get us. So there's also Wolof. which is also in further West Africa in the 13th century. So by my count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 certified states in Africa. I didn't make this up. This is actually coming from a book by Michael Tomowski about the political organizations of Africa. And so this is not coming from an Afrocentric thinker, as if that would discount it, but just to show how widespread the knowledge of African modernity and legal sophistication is becoming. Again, one of the great books that I have is The Precolonial States of Africa by a political organization by Michael Tomowski, who asserts all of these. We're not done. 16th century, right? 16th century, 1500 AD, 1550, 1570. Columbus has just gotten to the Americas with the help of North African sailors. Egypt, France, Germany, all these other folks are now coming into statehoods. They are just now adopting the university, which was brought to them by African Moors in Sevilla, Spain. So now this idea of education, we're now past the Renaissance. We're now in the Enlightenment. 1500, we're talking about Rene Descartes, right? So the beginnings of European intellectualism. Well, in Africa, what's going on? All right, the states of Africa, the states that exist in Africa at that time: Egypt, Turkish Africaya, Morocco, Funj, Adal, Ethiopia, Swahili states, Bornu, Hausa, Kabir, Nupe, Karafarfa, Songhai, Mali, Wolof, Mossi, Bonomansu, Yoruba, Benin, Congo, Luango, Tio, Banyura, Buganda, Monomatapa, and Malawi. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm not even going to count. That's over 20. Right? Over 20 states in Africa by the year 1600. Right? So there's an abundance of information. There's abundance of records for us to look at and determine whether there is a cultural unity. Now, again, that there's 20 states suggests that, wow, how do you get a cultural unity out of so many segmented people? And yet, astoundingly, you do. That most, if not almost all of these states are organized in very, very similar ways. And they all seem to stem from the Bantu migration out of West and East Africa. Okay, so how do we go from the original Queen Mother of us all, the first woman born as a human somewhere in East Africa, millions and millions of years ago, to now, and how do we establish this idea of law in that respect? So I mentioned in the introduction that I believe very firmly, and others tend to agree, that law is a product of agriculture, and agriculture is a product of women's activities, right? So we imagine, and for reference on this one, you might want to check out what we call How Societies Are Born by Jan Van Sina, a very preeminent professor at, I believe, the University of Wisconsin. And so agriculture is thought to be one of the early progenitors of civilization and law, because if you're hunting and gathering and moving from place to place and just taking what you can find, there really isn't enough. I mean, you could have rules between individuals, but family rules, clan rules, there really isn't an opportunity much to govern over other people. So within a family, yeah, there could be rules. And when we talk about those who grew up in the ice ages and what have you that didn't deal with agriculture, right, there's more power, right, what I can extract for myself. However, when you're in we did have hunter-gatherers and all that in Africa, but at a certain point, somewhere along the line, we don't know who, there's not a plaque to their name, but someone, and we assume it would be women, noticed that seeds or things are growing out of the ground. And if I, instead of going from place to place to place to place, control this particular area, and control these seeds or these plants or what have you, then we can not number one, eat. And while we have enough to eat, and it's growing on its own for most of the day, I have the time to then create a homestead. I have the time to create other things. And hopefully, perhaps maybe that's the man's job or to supplement. But the idea that we control land for an amount of time, and we're setting up sedentary peoples here to till this land, and that we're growing things on it. And when we grow things on it, that becomes the beginning of property, right? And when I say property, property is a legal concept. It doesn't necessarily just mean things. Now, things are the essence of what can be propertized. But again, intellectual property, thoughts, my image, we're talking about those things as property now. On the other hand, a child, you can make the argument that a child is a thing, but a child could never be property. And so property is a concept. And the concept means that society is respecting that this is yours, and that society itself will protect it as yours. We will agree that other people can't touch what is yours, right? That is what property is. The idea that we as a community will come out and defend your right to exclude others from such things. No one can use my image or likeness, and yes, they can. But because it's property, I can expect the state apparatus to do something to issue consequences or deal consequences on this person who has broken the agreement of not using my stuff without my permission or payment or what have you. And so agriculture becomes property the more we have a greater population of families and clans that live together, and then we have to create rules. Because think about agriculture for a second. If I'm growing corn, and if I'm growing anything, doesn't matter, there's a period of time where nobody can touch it, right? It's not ripe yet. It's not ready to be picked. And not only that, even if they did want to use it while it's unripe, I have plans for it. I planted it. I'm not going to reap what I sow for some time. And yet someone else could just walk upon the land, walk past, and decide that they're just going to take it. So on the one hand, I could protect it myself, me, my family, my children, or what have you. We got sticks or knives and swords and whatnot, and we'll come after anybody that comes after our crops. Or what could we do? We could have an agreement between all the families, right? That if you do this, this becomes your property. This is your real estate. You have rights to this land. Right? Then on top of that, we also will come together as a community and put consequences on those who have now touched the things on your property, on your real estate without your permission, right? If we're going to plant corn, and again, that corn is not just for me. If I grow enough of a surplus, then I can exchange it and share it with someone else who makes clothing. Or I can exchange it with someone else who makes hats or is an expert builder of homes or fences or whatever the case may be. So for me to not have a surplus of corn affects everybody else in the community because they were relying on my having corn. So now we have to have this in agreement that, hey, nobody touches Jim's corn, nobody touches Hassan's crafts while he's sleeping, or else not just Jim is authorized, because we could just say Jim is authorized to go get him. That's fair. Jim, he took your stuff, go get him. But no, we as a society will then go get this person, take away their goods, punish them for breaking the agreements or the rules or quote unquote law of our society for our benefit. This requires what? A government, right? So now if we are saying that other people instead of the individual is supposed to exact consequences on those who break the law, then we are talking about a class of folks that have quote unquote authority. Right, and the more sophisticated, the more people we have, the more danger we have around. guess what? These people have to be, or tend to be, freed from their own responsibilities of growing their own corn, right? That their job now becomes protecting other people's corn. Their job becomes settling disputes about who can touch the corn. Their job becomes settling disputes about where does this person's land stop, where does this person's land begin. They now have to settle disputes about this person's cow, or this person's children, or this person's whatever trampled over these other people's crops or what have you. And what do we do with that? What is the outcome? Again, we could leave it all to private discussion and private dispute resolution, but then when it gets violent or whatnot, we have a detriment to all of society. So this idea of having a central government, or those with authority that can make decisions that everyone will respect, also adds to the concept of law and governance. Okay, but if I can't grow my own crops because I'm settling disputes, if I can't create my own craft wares or build my own house because I'm busy protecting your stuff from marauders and people from outside our whole crew, our whole social system, if my job is to protect you from that, how do I eat? Right? Who takes care of my family? Who protects my stuff? And so now we have this concept, rudely speaking, of taxation. Right? That in order to have this central class of folks that are going to implement the rules of society, they have to be taken care of as well. And from that point, we have this idea of, okay, well, a portion of my wheat or corn, a portion of my glasswares that I'm making, a portion of time that we're going towards building a house, we will all contribute to the state. So those that can run the state can eat, right? Now now we have this taxation, we have this governance. Now we get, you know where we're going. What if this government then overtaxes the people and then doesn't do enough? What happens? Isn't this kind of sweet that I don't have to grow my own corn, that I don't have to tend to the cattle, and I still get to eat so long as I am protecting everyone else? And especially if I don't even have to protect everyone myself by myself. What if I just pay someone else or have someone else do it and I take the credit? So that's when we seem to establish within a ruling class amongst the people. So we get this division, right? That oftentimes the most powerful family controls the area. They and then take taxes from everyone else to support themselves. And yes, they return it in the sense of protection. And if somebody messes with you, you come to us and whatnot. However, on the one hand, it can be very helpful. On the other hand, it can be very exploitive. So we also know that states can grow internally to defend themselves, but then there's also offensive states. What if I see this agriculture going on down there and everything's good? And let's say I'm a hunter-gatherer, or I'm a pastoralist, or I'm just a band of guys who just want things easy. Well, I could then, if I have superior weaponry, impose taxes on that agricultural society just for the privilege of me not attacking them. So you support me, you lay out the food and whatnot, you lay a certain portion of it, I will let you live, but you have to set us out every month with this amount of food, with this amount of stuff, or we then attack you. And that's the security we're providing you, is the security from us. And we see pastoral societies and agricultural societies competing with each other many in these instances. And it's interesting because the agricultural societies tend to be maternalistic, right? Matrilineal, whereas the more aggressive or offensive societies often tend to be paternalistic, right? Born through animal husbandry, right? The idea that I can take this animal and make it do for me what I don't want to do for myself, and then applying it to women, children, etc. So the state apparatus, we're not suggesting it's a good thing or a bad thing, is my point. It just is. right? That the sophistication is something that occurred in Africa thousands and hundreds or hundreds and thousands of years before its European development. And while we can be proud of its legal sophistication, it's not really the idea that it as a governing thing is just better than everything else, because it can be very supportive of equality and production and greatness. On the other hand, it could be productive of exploitation and even slavery. When we get to this point, right, the scholars talk about different levels of the state. That we start with an early state, as we described, where maybe one family, and this is where we even go back to Egyptian dynasties, right? It's all about Big Mama, right? It's all about the queen mother, who basically has charge of the land, and basically every child that's around is connected to Big Mama somehow, right? That's the queen mother. And so even if men are on the farm or on the property running how things go, it's still in respect of Big Mama. It's still in respect of Queen Mother. If she says A happens or B happens, then that's more or less what happens, right? We don't respect our mothers. That's how many songs do we hear from hip hop, reggae? It's supposed to be this hyper masculinity, toxic masculinity, whatever you can call it. But you want to hear people sing and praise and venerate their mothers, listen to brothers all the time. And so that was the thing. In a matrilineal society, the sons, at least the good sons, right, stayed home and took care of the land, right? They took care of their sister's children. Now, some of us, again, weren't content with that. So we go out and we found other communities. We're restless. We go out elsewhere and do stuff. But the typical male was home and basically in support of his family. And that means the family of his mom instead of the one he starts by himself. And so he takes care of his sister's kids basically more than he takes care of his own. As a matter of fact, we know his sister's kids are his sister's kids. Before we have paternity tests, we aren't really sure whether his kids are his kids. What's the saying? Mama's baby, papa's maybe. So we know that his sister's kids are part of the lineage. They come from the Queen Mother, and that they are the owners of the land, with men being selected to be the caretakers of it. It's interesting because we can talk about Egyptian cosmology in that way. We'll talk about that more in the next episode when we talk about Mot and the combination of Ra and Mut, Jeb and Nut, Osiris and Isis, right? Horus and Hathor, Set and Nephtor, right? There's always this combination, and typically the woman represents the perfection of the concept, while the men represent the action. Like Mot is the perfection of liberty. Justice, harmony, and balance. But Thoth is the person or the judge that actually goes out and tries to judge folks on the basis of whether they meet the standard of the feather of Mot. So in early state, this ruling class is all part of one family. But as it grows, then the prime minister or the viziers or the minister of defense or whatnot becomes someone within the ethnic group. Why? Because just because your family doesn't mean you're good. I need somebody better than Joe, who's, I know he's family, but this is all going to fall apart. So an intermediate state has more regular taxation. An early state also has ad hoc taxation, right? We're going to run around and take your stuff because we need it to fight a war now. You may not see us for another year or 2 years, who knows? But whenever we come through, we run this jurisdiction, and you pay us what we need. Almost like George Washington. Continental Congress did not pay well for the Revolutionary War. George Washington's troops came around. If you saw them, you would tuck your chain, because they were going to take your stuff, and then they were going to give you a slip of paper and say, we'll pay you back after the war. That's what we're talking about, ad hoc taxation, right? And again, the United States is not even a state at that point. It's early. Now, again, an intermediate state, we go from family governance to basically an ethnic governance, We have more regular taxes, usually simple types of taxes. We also might tax trade routes and tolls and fees for those that want to sell goods in a market that we control. But then in advanced state, we have meritocratically appointed government officials. In an advanced state, it would not matter what your ethnicity or your race or your gender or whatnot is. It's all about the qualifications to be in the state. So it's interesting because if you look at the United States from this perspective, you would see an early state where it's just wealthy families, and families run all the local state governments in the pre-colonial stage. Then after the revolution, you have a more intermediate state where white folks as an ethnic group are the only ones entitled to governance, and taxation becomes a little more regular. And then later, after the 60s, we become a more complex state where the idea that government, the president, Barack Obama, is elected meritocratically, that taxes, no one is exempt from taxes. We're still working on that they're ubiquitous and regular. So and apparently folks didn't like that. They want to make the Make America Great Again crowd seems to want to reduce the United States from an advanced state back to an intermediate state, because that's where they did well, right? They were the ones that were on top instead of sharing the power and authority and the wealth with others based on deservedness versus whether you were an affiliate of the ruling group. This taxation of this regular taxation of the state, going all the way back to the pre-colonial states of Africa, the 20, the 30 of them that existed, hundreds and thousands, they all seem to follow what is called African feudal taxation. Right? African feudal taxation. So what does that mean? So again, tax is the sine qua non of the state. If I don't have the tax, if I'm not able to tax your agriculture and be able to make you pay into the state, then we don't have this class of folks that can protect the corn, protect the roads, protect trade, and even just provide mutual defense. But how are we going to pay it? Are we going to pay money? First of all, let's deal with the fact that we did have money. American money is tree bark with dye on it. So let's not act like it's something special, right? Pull out a dollar bill or whatnot. That's a piece of a tree that's shaved real fine that has green ink on it and a picture. Right, so let's not act like money is some super fantastic invention. So that said, all money has to do is be rare and hard to counterfeit, right? And so cowrie shells were rare and hard to counterfeit. Copper wire was rare and hard to counterfeit. Certain raffia squares dyed basically cloth, right? If it was regulated, it could be rare, especially the rareness of the dye, and hard to counterfeit, again, because of the rareness of the dye. Those things were used as money throughout Africa in different places. So the idea that there wasn't a way to exchange goods prior to white folks coming along is just incorrect. Now, but we won't deny that often taxation was in kind, meaning instead of paying me money, we want the goods. So if I have 8 different provinces and one of them produces cotton, the other produces wheat, the other produces, weapons, the others are blacksmiths. Basically, we're going to ask, as the state, we're going to require each one, and this is what we call something of a caste system. We're going to have each province do what they're good at. You're good, your land, your air, your weather, your resources, your rivers, your creeks, that's good for this production of stuff. So please concentrate on that. And at the end of the day or year, we want a certain percentage of it to go to the state. Right? You're going to present it to us. We're going to have this big ceremony, big time stuff, right? You're going to sing, dance, it's going to be festive, and you're going to bring to the king or the central government, here, our time is great, and the winds and the rain and the sun and fantastic, and here, this is the wealth that we contribute to the state. And each and every province is going to offer that up to the state. And the interesting thing about the state is, although we Africans understood the power of the ruling class, and therefore there's jurisprudence or there's tenets or dynamics that are there to restrain it. And so there is a saying that says, because the king has everything, he need nothing, right? So to restrict the power of the king, there's an acknowledgement that he is wealthy, that he owns everything on the land, or he's at least the caretaker of it, chosen by the Queen Mother and the gods and the Council of State. But to restrain his power of being arbitrary with those goods is to say that they aren't yours, right? You can have them anytime you want them. So to controlling and hoarding them for yourself is meaningless, right? Your power is in the distribution of them back out to the provinces. So when the central government receives cotton, when it receives wheat, when it receives corn, when it receives weapons, when it receives craft wares, and then what? As gifts, because this province was so good to us, or this province was loyal, or this province defended our territories, we're giving those items that were distributed to the state back out to those provinces, especially ones that didn't have it. So now the province that grew cotton, now through the gifts and the redistribution of taxation, now has cotton, wheat, corn, weapons, crafts, etc. That's how we diversify the economy through taxation. So taxation, even as is beyond everyone paying their fair share or maintaining the state or maintaining just a ruling class and protecting themselves, it's also a way to diversify and make the economy grander and greater. And the more successful we're doing that, the more people want to come and be a part of this jurisdiction. So greater power and greater intellectual muscle and whatnot happens. So this is the typical, what we call African feudal taxation. It's a thing. I didn't make it up. You can look at anthropologists like Jan Van Sina, Michael Tomowski, Henry Claassen. It's pretty well documented that the lion's share of African states just described followed that mode of governance. We can even, I wrote a book about 5 years ago, Black Tax, Tax Law and Racial Economic Justice, and I compared the state of Ankole in Uganda versus Jimmer al-Jafar, which was in Ethiopia. Abu Jafar was a land that was pretty much dominated by Arabs. And so we saw that it was governed different than Ankole, which was in Uganda and followed the traditional African feudal taxation route. And we note that the ubiquity of this governance structure follows basically, we can call this Bantu federal taxation. Who are the Bantu people? You've probably heard the word B-A-N-T-U. You may know that over 75% of all people in Africa, as vast and large a land as Africa is, which could contain the United States, which could contain China, and all together, 75% of the people, or even more than that, speak a derivation of the same language, the Bantu language, right? And Bantu just means the people, right? So the people of Africa. So when we talk about when Chancellor Williams, the great Chancellor Williams in The Destruction of Black Civilization, great book, get it, Chancellor Williams, The Destruction of Black Civilization, when he presents the African Constitution, he's really presenting the Bantu Constitution, right? Because those are the folks that basically took the greatness of ancient Egypt and especially Nubia, Meroe, Napata, Kush, Kerma, as the jumping off point for the civilization builders. We know that it went west to Takur, to Ghana, Mali, Songhai. We know that it existed with the Sao people in Khanum. All of these were right on the Sahel or around sub-Saharan Africa in the north. However, as Asians, Persians, Greeks come down the eastern side and take over Egypt, as Arabs and Europeans and Portuguese take over the northwestern side and come down, we know that there's several diasporas. We know that the people that used to hold power in Upper Egypt, in Khanum, in Nubia, in Ghana, that now they are subjected to Islamic forces or Persian forces or the forces of Baal, and they move further south to the interior. So it's acknowledged that in two places, the Bantu migration emanates from two places, from the east and the west. And Chancellor Williams notes that there is no migration. There is migrations, that they overlap wave after wave after wave after wave of people, especially the metallurgists or the blacksmiths. Right? So there's a caste of blacksmiths that after 100 AD, after 300 AD, after 500 AD, become very well gifted in iron making and even steel making. Nubia is called the Birmingham of Africa. And once you develop these iron tools, then cutting through the forest, establishing agriculture all over the continent becomes much easier. There are people already there, right? The people have spread out through Africa millions of years prior. So again, these are waves of migrations. So there's already the Khoi Khoi or the San people, those that speak like in cliques, like in Southern Africa, like in The Gods Must Be Crazy. There's also the Twa people, or what many people call pygmies, and there's a story of an Egyptian trader bringing a brother back from the interior, a pygmy, and it causing a sensation in Old Kingdom Egypt. So we're seeing that these people that adopt agriculture and civilization all of a sudden come to see themselves as something different and spread their technology back towards all in waves back over the continent from north to south all the way down to southern Africa, and we see again these same systems. So Sheikh Anta Diop sees African cultural unity in the totems, in the language, in circumcision, in all types of other cultural traits. What I add to it is that the political governance was also between so many different jurisdictions and polities and peoples known as the Bantu. So when Chancellor Williams, and we're going to talk about the African Constitution as represented by Chancellor Williams, which I will call the Bantu Constitution. And you'll note that part of it is that they're free to leave. Again, this is all about equal protection of the law. And so on top of the fact that we have gender, matrilineality, we also have the idea that the people inside, if you don't like what's going on for whatever reason, just because spaghetti every day, I don't like spaghetti every day, and we as a class of people that don't like spaghetti every day can leave, right? That they're not forced upon us. That comes to an end, as we know. When we finally get to the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century, we see that we're pinched in by Portuguese on one side, Arabs on another. We see the systems changing from matriarchy to patriarchy, from matrilineage to patrilineage. As a matter of fact, when we talk about a very, very, very great state that probably nobody's ever heard of, Monomatapa, we're talking about a state. Imagine how big Africa is, and then a state of people that control more or less from the Congo all the way to the Congo River, all the way to the Zambia River. Please go get a map and just look at it, and especially the Peters projection map, because then it really gives you a sense of the immense jurisdiction. It starts as a free state, meaning if you set foot in there, you can't be enslaved. Slavery is not respected here. Like Queen Nzinga's Angola and Matamba, they fight often with the Jaga, who was a slave trading, marauding people, Tipo Tib, and those that exploited interior Africans because they felt they were inferior. Now that we've accepted, those on the coast have accepted Islam or Christianity or Judaism. And so it starts as a free state and it starts defensive, but because of all these migrations, because defense becomes that much more of a important government function, it starts to turn paternalistic, right? It becomes more masculine in order to protect. But as it becomes more masculine, it also turns its commitment to power over justice onto the people itself. So we have a great leader named Cheyenne. Right, greatness in the sense that Monomotapa becomes one of the greatest empires in the world, one of the greatest empires of Africa's history, and yet its commitment to equal protection starts to fade a little bit. So as starts off as a free state, but then we see patrilineality creep up. That all of a sudden we're trying to attract wealthy men, because with the idea that you can pass along the property that you create with your sons, right? And unfortunately, this has been a technique of the Portuguese and the Arabs and whatnot that had patrilineal systems to convert property that was controlled by black African women into controlled by foreign men. Right, so to marry an African woman, have access to the resources that are due her, but then under a patrilineal legal system to then control it therefore after. This is why control of Cleopatra was so important, regardless of whether she was black or white or whatever. She was coming from a matrilineal system where she, as queen mother, was the legitimate authority over all the land and whatnot. And so to get the allegiance of the people, it was up for Mark Antony and the patrilinealists to marry her and then force their laws on the people, which would then be patrilineal, and all the wealth from their marriage then going through the male line thereafter. It's very political. And so Cheyenne created those changes. He also was the first African state that we know of that violated the African Constitution as far as freedom to leave. We understand that Monomotapa became more, again, a state where the ruling ethnic classes, the 12 original provinces, had more rights than anyone else that then came into the state. Right, so it started off as this place where everyone was free and defended from slavery. But as the 12 provinces and the 12 original ethnic groups banded together, the wealth that they created, they used to subordinate all those that weren't down with their particular crew. And so in order to extract the most out of them, they were then not free to leave. And when you're not free to leave, okay, we were a free state, but now the citizens of that state become slaves to the state to the extent I can't leave if I choose not to live here. Beyond that, Cheyenne was also the first to create the king's army. Right. Again, one thing about African kings don't fight. If you might not have noticed, whereas other places in the world, kings were known for their military prowess. African kings didn't fight. We had military folks for that, a defense minister for that. Matter of fact, we don't want to scratch on the king because he's supposed to represent the health of the country. And since he's not the defense minister, he's not the head of the armed forces, it was a very interesting dynamic for Cheyenne to create the king's army to enforce law within the country. And therefore, so we see this commitment to equal protection waning, right, and ebbing before our eyes with the threat of slavery, the resistance to slavery, Islamic and Christian or Portuguese and Arab influence, and we see the weakening of traditional African political institutions in Monomotapa. And it's very interesting for it to happen in Monomotapa because it's so close to the interior and so far away from the coastlines. And then we can also see, again, Songhai and other places around Africa being colonized and their traditional African systems being placed asunder or subordinate to that of the ruling class. I wish I had a speech. We'll talk later about the destruction of Mombasa. So what happened? Right? If we were so great for thousands of years, Nubia, Kush, Axum, Meroe, Ghana, and all that, we just talked about all this greatness, all this wealth. So what happened? Right? How are you just going to let Portuguese and the Arabs just run up in your stuff and take it if you're so great? What happened? So many people place the blame on, and it's interesting going back to the issue of China, oh, Africans are too trusting. Right. Okay. So let's deal with that. The idea that missionaries either Islamic or Christian, were the first to enter Africa and then quote unquote soften the people and trick them into being colonized. To me, that perpetuates the myth of black inferiority. I don't think anybody was tricked, right? In my view, the reason why Africa had a golden era, had several golden eras, but in the last 2,000 years or last 1,000 years, has fallen behind the rest of the world economically and has fallen within a global system of white supremacy is technology, right? The peoples of the North, because of their experience with ice ages and whatnot, because their environments required them to have a stronger commitment to technology to master that environment, we see warlike inventions created outside of Africa and then used to subjugate Africans within. So think about the very beginning when there's only African states. There's Egypt, or Kemet, land of the blacks, but Kemet called Nubia Ta-Seti, the land of the bow, right? The land of archers. So this military technology, the bow and arrow, and there's talk of Nubians boasting and bragging that if you can stretch have your king speak to me when he can stretch his bow as wide as this. So Nubians had a military advantage. Think of the name Ta-Seti. Set is the god, is one of the original sons of Ra and Isis, right, along with Osiris. And it's interesting because Osiris seems to be the god of governance and the unity of the nation, where Set is the warlike brother. And it's interesting that those who praise Osiris attribute Set to Nubia when there's tension there, but then later Set becomes attributed with the North when the North becomes rebellious. And then later than that, Set becomes we know that Seti becomes one of the Egyptian pharaohs that comes up from the south to restore Africa or Egypt to its African roots, right? So again, Set is more, instead of linking Set with Satan as evil, we look backwards and link Set with warfare, right? Land of the bow god, Set. So that's when we're on top, technologically superior to those around us, and that's when Egypt and Nubia basically conquer other peoples around the world, where the Egyptian empire stretches from Punt in Kenya all the way to Palestine and almost all the way up to Syria. But we see that finally Egypt in the second intermediate period is invaded by outsiders, the Hyksos. And again, it's not because of trust, it's because of the horse and chariot. Somewhere somebody jumps on the back of a horse in northern Asia and changes the game. Right, changes the game. Now again, the climate in sub-Saharan Africa does not support a lot of cattle, camels, horses, because of the tsetse fly and other insects and what have you. So it's not that you weren't ingenious enough to create it, it's that the environment just didn't produce it or support it. So the Hyksos come through with horses and chariots and run us out. But again, we're not stupid. So once we get the gist of it and get our own horses and chariots, we chase the Hyksos out. And not only that, chase them out all the way to northern West Asia and create another great empire that stretches from interior Africa all the way up to almost Europe. But then the catapult. Right, Alexander the Great, he took the credit, but somebody invented the catapult. So you can't hide behind your fort or your city walls anymore. And so the Greeks take off and conquer vast places by using catapults. Again, a military technology that others did not have. Once you create that military technology, the intellectuals of the subject population scatter, and they often scatter to places with more wealth, which is usually the conquerors. And so that intellectual superiority comes after the military technology and usually not beforehand, and it then compounds upon itself. So then the Arabs come with cavalries, right? These horse and camel cavalries that go over the north and south. They're too much for those that don't have the speed that the lightning strikes. And so there we have again a pastoralist or marauding people being able to witness where the agriculture was, right? Because if I'm coming from Arabia, it's not a lot of agriculture there. I have a lot more desert there. But if I have military superiority, I can go over to these places with lots more agriculture with lightning speed and quickness and attack them and force them into treaties that pay us to not attack them, that require them to give us food, require them to give us people, women, men, slaves, or what have you, in order for us to not to spare you from our marauding attacks. And in that way, we have countries becoming supposedly Muslim because they're paying taxes to the Muslim government, but the people are still the same. And the people have more or less resentment for the Christianity or Muslim or the non-African imposed religion, even though the leaders are supposedly converted. And you'll see that the Arab scholars routinely say that this ruler or this ruler may have been claimed to be one of us, but really was impious. He was just, playing along because we had the power. And then the Europeans come with what? Guns, right? Once you come with guns, a band of 10 or 20 Europeans could take on several hundred, if not thousands, of Africans. So it wasn't about trusting. Yeah, they came in and pretended to be peaceful, but nobody believed that. You just had to. As a matter of fact, one of the techniques they had as Portuguese implemented for slaves was, the country we come upon, we're not going to enslave those people under the promise that they then get enslave those outside of their country. So we will spare you, but you then have to capture 10 or 100 people a year from outside, and you think they're inferior anyway because they're not part of Angola, or they're not part of TO, or they're not part of Buganda, and so these backward peoples in the bush, you run out and conquer them, but it's never enough. It's never enough. And once you don't come up with your quota, then you go to fill those quotas. So the noblemen and noblewomen of the countries that were formerly slave traders, eventually they get to you too. And that's known, but do you have the means to fight them? Because if you resist, what happens is the Europeans would come to you and only trade guns for people. They would only give you guns in exchange for slaves. If you refuse the deal, then we're going to go to your neighbors and offer them the same deal. And whichever one of you accepts the guns is going to then be more powerful than your neighbors. And so that was the Hobbesian choice that each African state was presented by Europeans to get the guns and incursions there. Now, let's say they all refuse. Well, that's what happened in Mombasa and Kilwa, and savages such as Vasco da Gama basically blew apart the entire place, raided it, killed the women and children, stripped them of gold while they were living, cut off arms and legs and ears just to take the wealth and run. And so once that happens and it spreads throughout the coastline of what they're able to do with their cannons and cannon fire, then we have basically capitulation. Let's even fast forward a little further, and then the American greatness stems from electricity. So we have another technology, electricity, that then separates, that really ramps up the separation from supposedly modern to primitives. By the 1800s or 1901, global white supremacy is at its peak, in part because of the claim that electricity in the modern era has come to all of Europe and its protectorates around the world and its colonies around the world, including the United States. And that the rest of the world is not only non-electric, but it is also then colonized. So white supremacy, in my view, was at its peak in 1901 because of the technological advancements that they created in warfare. However, since then, nuclear technology and all the rest has spread to the rest of the world. Computer technology has spread to the world. And so that advantage is not there anymore. And so that's what we're seeing today when we talk about, or at least I talk about, the whittling of white supremacy. It's not that the world is devolving and it's going to go into chaos. It's that the military and technological advantage that white people had to then corral a greater share of the world's resources for themselves, that is lessening. Their ability to do that is lessening because the technologies that they use are now incorporated by the rest of the world, including nuclear power and weaponry. So that is how law begins and how statehood in Africa was created, and then how it eventually devolved into colonies of Europe and the Americas. So after that 5,000 or 6,000 years of African legal history, or at least how these societies were born, tomorrow we're going to go back again and start with Mot. We're going to start with Toph and Imhotep, and start talking about Egypt and Nubia, about what the law specifically was. Now, we just talked about the political systems, but now we'll, after this, we'll talk about each particular state and the political systems that they implemented to create the greatness that I've just described. Thank you guys for listening once again. I know I went a little longer than I intended. I'm always going to do that, I assume. And then again, please check this out. Like or subscribe to Afrolantican.com YouTube page. To also buy, go to Amazon and buy Taxes, Death, and Trouble. And always better educate ourselves and our children. Start and patronize Black businesses. Stop unduly criticizing each other. Hotep.